Okay, so thank you. Let me introduce you, Sami. Sami Bellstadt is a radio astronomer in the University of Western Australia, but she's very involved in the Science Meets Parliament in Australia, which is a very interesting initiative that you will hear about today. And it's actually quite fitting, because after that we have Andrea Clement, who will be talking about a similar initiative that just started in Spain. So thank you very much, Sami, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and greetings from Wajak Noongar land here in Perth, Western Australia. Thanks to the distance, I'm presenting remotely, but thanks to the hybrid format, I can still speak to you today, so that's very exciting. So why am I speaking with you on this particular topic today? We've just heard that, yes, I'm an astronomer, and in this capacity as an astronomer and as a scientific researcher, I have been very, very fortunate to be able to attend this Science Meets Parliament event twice in the past. So once in 2019 and once in 2020. So I want to give you a relatively brief overview of this kind of event in Australia. Very specifically, I want to highlight that this is from the perspective of a scientist that has attended the event, not an organizer, and not from the political perspective either, which might be an interesting perspective. Now, Science Meets Parliament is an event that's organised by Science and Technology Australia, and that's an organisation that's important to highlight in the context of this talk, because they represent more than 80,000 scientists across Australia. And so as far as a voice to government is concerned, STA is one of the largest platforms for the political and the scientific voice. And so because they're headquartered in Canberra, they have excellent relationships with not only the parliamentarians themselves, but also the Office of the Chief Scientist, various scientific academies, the heads of various government science agencies, grant bodies, key industry players, etc. And so because of that connectivity, they're in an excellent position to organise this event annually that is known as Science Meets Parliament. What is Science Meets Parliament? I've heard it referred to on numerous times now as one of the favourite events from politicians in the Canberra calendar. So this is an exciting event, not just for scientists, but also for the political sphere. It's thus far been held annually for about 20 years. So it's a very established program and has been going for a long time. And what it is an opportunity for scientists across the broad range of the sciences to go to Canberra, spend 2 days engaging with potentially politicians, but also other scientists, to network and to practice some new skills. Now, of course, in the last few years, this has actually been held remotely for a change, as we're all familiar with, thanks to COVID. And so I've been lucky enough to attend in both the formats, once in person in Canberra and also once virtually. Now, who gets the opportunity to attend this event? Obviously, with 80,000 scientists represented across Australia, this is not something that's going to facilitate attendance for all 80,000. This is done through the various organisations that are member institutes of Science and Technology Australia. Now, I've put here a list that goes on and on and on, because there are many, many individual organisations. But if you flick across at the screen, your eye might find different keywords that are obvious to you. I see organisations that are represented through viticulture or molecular biology, biophysics. The list goes on. We've got fish biology, parasitology, geographers, mathematical sciences, plant scientists. In particular, I am a member of the Astronomical Society of Australia. That's one of the organisations that represents most of the astronomers within Australia. And so it is through that organisation in particular that I had access to this event. The way that this works is that typically these organisations have an opportunity every year to send a handful of their members to this event to represent their community. And this ensures a relatively balanced spread of scientists at an event like this, which is very exciting as a scientist who spends most of their time amongst astronomers to be able to attend an event that has such a broad sweep of STEM professionals in it. What happens at this event? Typically, it's a multi-day event. So in person, this was 2 conference days. Online, this was held over multiple weeks with multiple sessions to avoid the Zoom fatigue that we heard talked about earlier today. And these sessions consist of multiple different kinds of events. We have many keynote speakers. So these might be people like the Chief Scientist of Australia. We have many panel sessions. And so these are very valuable ways of collecting expertise on various different topics, whether that might be things like the lobbying process, or whether that's with experience within building relationships with policymakers and parliamentarians, and trying to find a way of communicating that to the various attendees of the event. It comes very excitingly with attendance of the annual Press Club address. So Press Club address happens very, very frequently at the National Press Club in Canberra, but once a year there's a special edition of this event that's associated with Science Meets Parliament that takes on a much more scientific thread than it perhaps usually does. The 2 years that I've attended this event, we've had Lisa Harvey-Smith, who is a Women in STEM organizer in Australia. And also last year we had Dr. Kathy Foley, who is Australia's chief scientist. And so there were two very exciting speeches that we were able to attend as scientists in Canberra. There's also a gala dinner, which is also very exciting. And then the pinnacle of the event, I guess, is the meeting with the parliamentarians themselves as scientists. And I'll get to that in a little bit more detail later. At various times throughout the event, the organized events actually split into two separate streams. And so this is done in order to better cater toward the actual experiences of scientists when it comes to engaging with policy and Canberra and government in general. The great advantage of this is that regardless of whether an individual has had absolutely no experience with the political sphere at all versus someone who's engaged quite a bit in the past, this is a very inclusive event and there's something for everyone. So the first of these streams is the so-called new to Canberra. So this was definitely me in my first year of Science Meets Parliament. And that includes events like, what actually is lobbying? How does that work? Why is it an important thing? There was also much more hands-on activity involved. We had an opportunity to practice your pitch. If you're being faced with someone who works completely outside of the scientific sphere, what is the best way to discuss what it is that you do in a way that is engaging to someone else? For those that have perhaps had a little bit more experience with Canberra in the past, or who have had the lucky chance of being at a Science Meets Parliament event already in the past, there's also a taking it to the next level stream. And so that takes it up a notch. At that point, we were discussing aspects like, how do you contribute to government inquiries? How do you actually contribute to the knowledge that is required to eventually build into bills and policy? Social media as an agent of change was one of the aspects that was done. How can you use social media to really promote science, not just to other scientists, but also to the general public and also to government and to policymakers? I talked a little bit about panel discussions. For the rest of the talk, I've scraped the Twitter sphere, which is an excellent resource for trying to see what happens at these events. And there are various people that have showed photographs of what these kinds of things look like. So I've tried to take a sample of those to give you an idea of what it's like to be at the Science Meets Parliament event. Here I've highlighted a couple of different panels that I personally also really enjoyed. The first of these to the left was a panel on science and evidence-based policy. This was really interesting because it was actually with various members of Parliament. We had Adam Bant from the Greens, Richard Miles from Labor, and Katie Allen from the Liberal Party. And that was just a very cooperative discussion on what does it look like to incorporate science and evidence-based policy into everyday life as a politician. Fascinating to listen to. There was another panel discussion on preparing for tomorrow. So this was really about how do you advocate for science and how do you use science to produce a tomorrow that we need to work toward. And of course, we are all familiar with the fact that we have many global challenges that Australia is partaking in, and many of those require science and scientific knowledge as a critical building block. And so this is a general discussion on how do we utilize that and build on that. I've taken here some examples from panel sessions that were done in the virtual format, and these little headshots we'll all be very familiar with after the last couple of years of Zoom conferences. But other panel discussions we had were on how to be a good ambassador for STEM. This is perhaps a little bit tangential to what we might think of as engaging with policy and government, but this idea of creating an inclusive scientific community, whether it's gender, sexual status, whether it's the country of origin, as we've discussed quite a bit here in this forum, it seems. These are all important things to create a community that is in a better situation to then speak to the broader community and speak to government. And then finally, there was another session that I thought was really interesting about STEM and the news cycle. I think we can all appreciate that many aspects of government and politics is very much meandered along a path based on what's going on in the news. And for that very reason, the way that STEM, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics, is portrayed in the news cycle, then also affects the ability for STEM to have any sort of platform to speak with respect to government. And so this was a panel that had various journalists and science content producers discussing the best ways to present science in the news cycle. So very, very interesting panel discussions that were a real source for knowledge that we might not have access to just within our scientific research communities. One that was also particularly interesting is the Meet the Chiefs session that is held at every Science Meets Parliament. So this is a session where we meet the chief scientists of various large scientific organisations within Australia. I've got here a snapshot from my first year at Science Meets Parliament, but these include the chief scientists for organisations like the Australian Antarctic Division, CSIRO, Geoscience Australia, the National Measurement Institute, and the Bureau of Meteorology. As an early career researcher, these are the kinds of people that I generally wouldn't have access to on a daily basis. These are the people that organise hundreds of scientists on any given day. And so to have a group of these individuals that have significant responsibility and leadership and connection to government discuss this in one place was really, really fascinating. And I think most importantly for me, it was really interesting to hear how highly prioritised collaboration amongst the scientific communities is as far as producing really good scientific outputs within their scientific organisations, and how important it is for people at that leadership level to find ways of producing really, really good collaboration. Of course, the most key part of this event, Science Meets Parliament every year, is the opportunity for scientists to have a one-on-one meeting, or a four-on-one meeting a lot of the time, with parliamentarians themselves. This is something that everyone is always very excited about. Scientists are very excited to be able to sit with a real politician, something we often don't do, and have a frank discussion about topics that are important to either parties. I've included here a number of different pictures of smiling faces at these meetings. These meetings typically last between half an hour and an hour. They're carefully curated by Science and Technology Australia. So every individual scientist who attends this event has a list of 4 or 5 topics that they find particularly important. And then based on those topics, individual meetings are crafted such that politicians are speaking with scientists that have relatively similar topics of interest. These are across the board. And what I found really interesting as well is that you're embroiled in the political goings on in Canberra when you're involved in these meetings. A lot of the time people have the experience of finally sitting down, having a really intimate conversation about various topics, and all of a sudden the bells go off in Canberra indicating that there's some bill that needs voting on, and suddenly everyone has to run away. And so some of these meetings inevitably get cut short, as we all learn is a very typical experience in Canberra. But these are very exciting, and with the various sessions that happen in Science Meets Parliament, you gain the skills to be able to have a meaningful conversation at this event. Very, very exciting. And of course, the Gala Dinner is a big highlight for many people. And in particular, I think rather than just the smiling faces and the wonderful outfits, dressing up like this is not something that scientists do on a very often basis, so this is always good. I think what these photos highlight more than anything else is that Science Meets Parliament has been a fantastic opportunity for individual scientists to network and get to know other scientists that they wouldn't necessarily engage with on a professional basis, whether that be a soil scientist or a geoscientist or a mathematician and an astronomer, and just discuss on broad scale scientific topics that are really relevant in a national context, not just at the really local level. I'll get to the end. I may be very fast, but I think that's okay. What are some of the things that I took out from this event in particular? And I think one of those biggest things upon reflection for this talk is the importance of building relationships over time. If there is a scientist with a message that really needs to go toward politics for the sake of making long-term political changes, those things don't happen instantly. And so building relationships with key political players over time is critical. Don't be afraid to reach out to individual members of the political sphere in order to build those relationships. It doesn't always have to start with an ask, as it's referred to. A lot of the time in science, that ask could be funding. But the scientific community is well within its capability to reach out and say, how can I help? What is it that I can provide to the political sphere that will be useful? And that's a two-way street. Coming out of this event, I also felt that I had a distinct sense of...
Sorry, Sabine, 1 minute.
Oh, perfect, I'm almost done. Of collegiality between politicians. A lot of the time in the media, we hear a lot of conflict and we only hear the things that parties disagree on. But in fact, they are very collaborative on most topics. And it's actually a very, very positive sphere in many senses. Politicians love to engage with people. They are people themselves, and they love to hear a human story. So if science can be phrased as a human story, all the better. There's an incredible value in collaboration amongst scientists. Even though this is Science Meets Parliament, there was a lot of science meets science, and that was incredibly valuable. And policies are not written overnight. Long, large changes of the political sphere that require scientific input need time, lots of policy experts and advisors, and lots of relevant engagement with the sectors. And I'll just finish to say that Science Meets Parliament 2022 is already open for registration. If you're a scientist and you're interested in attending, get in touch with your STA member. The lineup of people speaking at the event looks really exciting, and I see has 3 astronomers amongst it. So we're unduly biased in our representation. Very exciting. Anyway, I'll leave it there if anyone has any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sabine. Okay, we got time for one question. We got one in the back. No, the microphone is off, probably.
Hello, my name is Oscar. Thank you very much for the presentation. I was just curious to know if the Australian universities are part of these organizations that you listed at the very beginning, because it seems that all of them were just organizations. Are the universities part of it or not?
It's a good question. I'm actually not sure. As far as I understand, it does require an STA organization member to approve, or at least I think anyone can register to attend this event, but it does require approval from an STA member organization. So that's something that I would need to check and would need more details on.
Just on a funny note, it was great to see all the pictures, and I saw my colleague Kalinda there in all the pictures. You're having a great time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Time for the very last question.
Thank you, Sabine. Just to mention that there is another very important event in Canberra. This is the Science Diplomacy Club, organized by a series of Spanish embassies. It's the Embassy of Spain, Switzerland, Italy, and Germany. And it's a major networking event happening in Canberra as well. The next one is organized by the Spanish Embassy next week.
Wonderful. Thank you for that tip.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sabine. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.